You are listening to the Speech Space Podcast, a podcast full of tips and resources for SLPs. I'm your host, Jessica Cassidy, and this is episode 44. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about using AAC in children with autism with special guest Susan Berkowitz. Before we get started, I wanted to take a brief moment to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by the Digital SLP membership site, which is a site that features time-saving, no-print, and low-prep resources for SLPs. Unfortunately, the Digital SLP membership site is currently closed for new members. However, on January 15th of 2019, I plan to choose one lucky podcast reviewer to win a free year of access to the Digital SLP membership. So hop on over to iTunes and leave a review for the show and tune in on January 15th to see if you were the lucky winner. If you'd like to learn more about the membership or jump on the wait list to be the first to know when the doors open back up, please head on over to thespeechspace.com/digital SLP. Like I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about using AAC in students with autism. And before I bring special guest Susan Berkowitz on the show, I did want to let you know a little bit about her. She's been an SLP for more than 40 years, during which time she's concentrated predominantly on AAC, except for 8 years where she was working in a school district with significantly language learning disabled students in grades K through 8. She has worked for more than 45 years with students with autism. Susan has extensive background in psychology, special education, speech pathology and audiology, school administration, and applied behavior analysis. She has worked as a practitioner, supervisor, director of communication department, and director of education. Susan's clinical expertise has included public and non-public schools, nonprofit community agencies, residential settings, and her own private practice. She's been published in peer-reviewed professional journals and presented at national and international conferences. She has recently completed a book called Making the Connection, providing how-to advice for parents and SLPs new to AAC. Susan also owns Language Learning Apps, LLC, and is the developer of Question It and Sound Swaps apps for the iPad. She also creates and sells adapted special education and AAC curricular materials on her website, which I will link to in the show notes of this episode. All right, let's go ahead and bring Susan on the show. Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about using AAC in children with autism.
Thank you for having me, Jessica. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about your experience as an SLP and specifically in regards to AAC?
Okay. Well, I started working with kids with autism about 45 years ago. And when I was in college and when I was looking at graduate school programs, I was looking for something with a specialty in autism, which there weren't very many of back then. And I had been teaching kids signs to communicate, and I thought that was really the kind of thing that I wanted to do. So I went and got my degree in speech pathology and audiology. And that's pretty much what I've been doing ever since, mostly with kids with autism, though not entirely, and mostly with AAC, though not entirely, but it's just sort of grown from there, and I've moved with the times as the field has changed quite significantly over the past 40 years, and it's been kind of fun and exciting to watch. Frustrating when it felt like it wasn't growing fast enough. But there's, it's still a fairly young field, but there's now a pretty consistent body of research informing our practice. And I just really love it. They're the kids I love working with, and I love being able to give somebody a voice and have them be able to communicate with the world. So I've been happily doing it for 4 decades.
That's great. That's great. I love that. How you said you're giving someone a voice, because you really are when you're using AAC. And you mentioned research. I know that you wrote a nice blog post on AAC and its evidence for children with autism. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as I said many years ago, and when I first started working with kids with autism, it was still called childhood schizophrenia.
Oh, wow.
Which has changed. And there was not a lot of information out at all. Back in the 60s and 70s, we started doing some research with using signs. And that's, in fact, what I wrote my master's thesis about, was teaching signs to kids with autism, which seemed to be a much more efficient and effective way to teach them to communicate something than traditional speech therapy was. There was just not a lot of movement with what we were doing in speech therapy at the time, and so it was kind of exciting. When I first started working with kids once I got my degree, it was a lot of the same kind of slogging. We tried traditional therapy stuff. We taught signs, and eventually we got to a point. I was out here in California, and there was a teacher who worked for the Los Angeles County system who made some drawings, and I got my hands on a copy of those, and was using the drawings with the kids that I was working with, and it was really exciting to see them learn to point to a picture or touch a picture or hand you a picture in order to tell you what they wanted. And then, of course, it took quite a number of years after that for the picture communication symbols to finally make their way out. And it hasn't been all that long that there has been, as I say, a body of research about using AAC with autism and different types of augmentative communication. At first, I think Andrew Bondi and the folks who developed the picture exchange communication system had the most research out and about. And again, they had a really good success rate with kids with autism. And what we've discovered since then, though, is that it's not the most efficient way to teach augmentative communication, that you're limited in vocabulary and in language development. And so we've moved on from that a lot. In the last decade, I guess, my work with kids in autism, and I've consulted to school districts, so I run a private practice and had an independent consulting business. And so I've seen autistic kids all over Southern California, trained teachers and other SLPs and staff, and it's really been exciting to see evidence-based practices getting out there more in the world, and seeing kids learn not only to communicate but also learn literacy skills in kids who for many years people thought that just wasn't possible and wasn't going to happen. I love that we are thinking more now that kids with autism can communicate, and not just with behaviors. They can learn to read and to communicate through the written word. And so it's always just been a fascinating field to me, and I love the way that it has changed and grown, and that, again, the evidence, if you look, Gail Porter has been using her POD books, Pragmatic Organized Dynamic Display books, in Australia for 25-30 years at this point, and she's teamed up with some SLPs here in the States, and with Joanne Cafiero, among others, and they've done research studies showing work with kids with autism with POD books, and the pragmatic aspects of that having really good success with them. And I've worked with kids that I've given POD books to, and all sorts of other systems, and it's really fascinating. I'm almost sorry I'm retired. Not really, but in a way, I'm having a hard time letting go, and I still keep reading the journals and watching webinars and trying to keep up with the field, because there is still so much happening. And we've learned a lot. I think there's so much more, obviously, since the first signs we taught to kids in the 70s. But just about building language, and not just teaching requesting, but getting kids to come in. And we get so caught up with the I want X, and I have surely handed out my fair share of M&Ms in over the course of my career. But if you look at so many kids with autism, they want to say, leave me alone, go away. I don't want this. He's bothering me. I need a break. I got to get out of here. None of those things are simple requests. They're not I want statements most of the time.
Right.
It might say, I want you to go away, but that's a longer sentence than I'm going to get out of most kids.
True.
So I love that we're starting to look a lot more carefully at the functions and the pragmatics and what is this kid trying to say to me, and it's not just I want a cookie.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. Now, I know that you're a big fan of using communication temptations. What are some examples of some of those that SLPs who are listening today can use in their speech room this week?
Anything that you know that the child likes. Have it visible, have it available, just out of reach, and not always just out of reach, but find what is going to motivate that child. And we know that changes frequently over time. We know kids can get satiated on something. We know that their likes and dislikes change from day to day. And so you've always got to keep up with that, survey of what their reinforcers or motivators are, what they like and what they want. And have those available. Have them out. Then model, so I never travel without my bottle of bubbles. And I put those out, and I hold on to the blower part. And when kids start reaching, I start modeling bubbles, want bubbles, and then I start blowing bubbles, and then I stop, and I'll model more, or blow more, or more bubbles, and so we keep going that way. I have always traveled with a portable DVD player and a whole selection of DVDs. And so anything that you know that is going to tempt them, that they're going to want, and will motivate them to communicate something to you in order to get it. We try and stay away from the edibles, but as I say, bubbles, DVDs, any other toy. I have a Bert and Ernie Giggle Ball that has been the favorite of many a kid with autism. Anything is it, and have them out. And Barry Prezant, in his communication survey, has a little wind-up toy in a container, and he always has that out. And when the child reaches, they have to ask for help because they can't get the lid open, and then they have to ask for help to make it wind, to make it walk. And then when it winds down, they have to ask again. And again, anything like that will tempt the child to interact with you, that will get them to imitate the communication model, and begin to have some back and forth with you. Anything will work. And I've had kids for whom that's, jalapeno peppers. No, I am not torturing the poor child. But so your kid's best.
Okay, great. I did an episode a while back on using core words. I think that was episode 32. But I'm wondering what advice you can give to SLPs working with students who are moving beyond using single words. How do they bridge that gap?
So when we're doing that aided input, we're always doing it one step ahead of where the student is. So if you've got a student who's using one-word responses consistently, you want to start to model 2 words. When they're using 2 words consistently, you want to start to model 3 words. And so you're always pushing that envelope, that sort of zone of proximal development, one step at a time. We're still looking at core words. If you look at the 25 core words that toddlers use the most, and you start putting together 2-word combinations, you've got a huge number of things that you can say. Want that mine, it mine, put there, get it, on and on and on. There are so many 2-word combinations, 3-word combinations, and you can stick with a core word communication board of 25 or 36 or 40, depending on whose system you use, and be able to communicate so much, even without a lot of fringe words. We always want to have the fringe words there. They're important to kids. And we sometimes forget those in our rush to use core words so much. But I say, you're building language the same way you are with any child with minimal language. You just, go from one step to the next in a developmental progression. And sure, there are splinter skills, and sure, it's not the same typical development. But teaching language is teaching language. And I think a lot of speech pathologists who aren't familiar with augmentative communication kind of get worried about that a little bit. And I always say you really don't need to do much different from what you're doing with any other child who has minimal language. You're just going to build that language. And so there's not a lot that you need to do differently or to say differently or to have different materials with. You just need to add that alternative mode of response in. So I think, do it the way you do your language therapy normally. Core words can take you many, many places. There's Gail Van Tatenhove has a wonderful handout, and I don't know if it's still on her website, where she has the three billy goats gruff, all done in core words as a demonstration of how you can do it. And you can take a story and you can break it down to core words, and students who have nothing but their core word boards can tell you a story. And tell it as completely as any other child with some minimal language. But so I don't think you need to stress. You're still teaching language.
Yeah, I think that's really important to remember, because I think sometimes new grads or people switching into the school setting, they are intimidated when they hear AAC, and they're kind of like, where do I start? What do I do? And I think you bring up a really good point that, we know how to treat language disorders. So that's really how you do it.
That's all you're doing.
It seems so simple when you say it that way.
It is. It's funny because I make materials for AAC implementation and I sell them. And yet on the other hand, I say all the time, you don't really need anything else. You can use any of the materials you're using with your other kids. You're just going to add in a different response mode. You're going to add in a different modeling, not just verbal, but verbal plus pointing to the pictures, or verbal and signing. So it's not all that different, and I think that helps people a lot when you can reassure them. I think until we get to a point where AAC is a required and always found course in every grad program, people will still feel a little intimidated if they do run into those kids on their caseload and they're not prepared for them. But I don't know when that's going to happen. I'm not sure it's going to happen in my lifetime. I think there aren't enough people available to teach in every grad program in the country, but it would be nice.
So what about AAC myths? I know that's another blog post that I came across of yours, and I just wanted you, if you can remember from that post, to throw out a few of those that you want to clear up. And you can find almost every SLP who's involved in AAC has a version of that post that we do. So there are a couple of them, and some of them can be just really, really damaging. One is that the child doesn't have the prerequisite skills for learning AAC. And I love Pat Miranda's quote where she says the only prerequisite is breathing. Babies communicate. And if babies can communicate, so can anybody else. And we forget the long period of time in which we're giving language input to babies before they start to speak.
And so we need to be giving that picture-based input to picture-based communication users for that much time in order for them to learn to use a different system. And so it's not a matter of whether their cognitive skills are high enough or their developmental level is high enough. That's all a myth. It's what we're doing to teach them. They don't need any prerequisites before that. Another one is sort of the wait and see. And if you think about how many years of listening to language, how many millions of words a first grader has heard by the time they get to school, to wait and see with a student and wait and keep waiting. I was at an IEP a number of years ago for a 9-year-old girl, and everybody on the team from the school was saying, well, we need to wait and see because we think she'll develop some speech.
Oh, no.
And I said, but she's almost 10 years old, and she's frustrated, and you're complaining about her behavior. So can we not wait anymore?
Right.
So that one, that kind of makes me crazy. I will get parents often who have been told that their child, if they go through with this, will become dependent on a device and they won't learn to talk and it will hinder them, and the parent is never going to have a child who's verbal. Also a myth. And for many, many years, those of us working in the field said, no, that's not true. We know it. We've seen it. When we start using signs or pictures or whatever alternative mode of communication, kids who have any potential to be verbal develop more verbal skills, not less. Right. And there's finally, again, recently, a body of research that shows this, and studies that have been gone through. And in about 90-something% of cases, the child who's got the potential for being verbal will talk more when augmentative communication is used consistently. So that's another one. Let's see, too young, too impaired, too not going to talk. Let's see. The problem with getting old is remembering all of this stuff.
Well, I think those are great ones.
Yeah.
My next question is more geared toward SLPs working in the school, but are there any tips that you can give SLPs for making sure that their students are getting consistent access to their device or whatever their AAC, modality of choice is?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I've seen it in my own practice. I've had other speech pathologists tell me, and I talk to speech pathologists all over the country who run into the very same problem. It's often very hard to get buy-in from everybody on the team, whether it's the teacher or the parents or another SLP. People aren't always really sure. I've had classrooms where it's taken time and time again of doing training with the paraprofessionals to convince them that this is good and this is necessary and this will be beneficial, and they need to have it out on the child's desk at all times, not stuck on the top of the filing cabinet. And so I don't have a good answer, I'm afraid. I don't know that anybody does. That's still one of the biggest problems is getting consistent buy-in and having the consistency that you need. I actually had a parent recently tell me that they had a child who had an iPad with an app. They had it for 2 years. They weren't making any progress. She wanted me to consult and to work with the school team and get them up and running. And I said, well, I would need to train her too because, it needed to be a concerted effort. And she was adamant that she was tired of trying to do what everybody told her to do and not having it work. So I needed to prove to her that this was going to work. And once the school team was on board and making it happen, she would consider helping. I said, that's not going to work.
Oh,
and
wow.
I never heard from her again.
Oh, my goodness.
But, so it's not just school staff. It can be families. Getting the buy-in is tough. I know that sometimes in a school district, having one student be successful is the key. I was doing some consulting for a couple of years with a district near me, and the very first, no, second child they asked me to evaluate wasn't a child, 16-year-old teenager with autism, and he had a piece of cardboard with 10 pictures for an exchange system of his favorite reinforcers, and that was it. He was a big guy. He was energetic. He was strong. He was self-injurious. He's done permanent neurological damage from biting his hand.
Oh, wow.
And so I ordered him a communication device, but we know how slow purchasing can be in school districts. So I also made him a pod book, and I took it in, and they're about 125 pages. And so I went in, and the teacher and the aide just looked at me with the deer in the headlights look. But they were willing to try it, and they listened to the training, and this aide was fabulous. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from the teacher, and I could hear her jumping up and down. The APE teacher hadn't come, and the kid was upset, and he needed to let off steam, and he was really agitated, and he picked his hand up, and he started to bite it, and he looked at the communication book, and he put his hand down, and he went to the button that says, I have more to say. He turned to people and hit APE teacher, and then no, turned to actions and hit run, went to places, football field, and the aide took him out running around the football field, and that was what he wanted.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Now, 2 weeks doesn't always happen that way.
Right.
But
very true.
I had no problem with any other teacher or SLP in that district when I walked in with 125-page pod books.
Yeah,
so
that's
it
great.
just, it took one kid, and that made everybody in the district sit up and say, all right, we can do this. So sometimes that's kind of what you need. I don't have another good way. It's tough, and it's still a problem. And I'm not sure how to make it less of a problem, except to just keep on plugging away and doing training and trying to educate folks.
Yep. I think that's exactly right. That's really all we can do. And sometimes, like in that instance, that's enough. It works out. Okay. So before we wrap up today, I did want to give you the chance to talk about, I saw 2 things of yours I thought you might want to mention. I saw the AAC Core Vocabulary Kit on Teachers Pay Teachers. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about what that is? And I'll make sure I link to that in the show notes.
Okay. I do create a number of AAC implementation resources and sell them on Teachers Pay Teachers. I have a Getting Started kit, which is a great way to get started. There's a communication book that has core word boards and lots of extra vocabulary, so you have a wider range of core and fringe and the ability to add more. There are some teaching resources in there, and some interactive books for specific core words, and lots of goodies to help you get started with implementing. I've got lots of other resources on there. One of them is 10 weeks to 40 core words, which was based on the DLM 40 core word board. And so I have a variety of those. And so there's a good range of materials from very, very beginner, just getting started with a couple of core words, to putting sentences together and developing narratives.
Perfect.
For AAC users.
That sounds great. And then I also wanted to ask you about your book.
So yes, that was my the baby I birthed this year. It was almost as painful. So I've worked, one of the things I did here in San Diego, there's a San Diego Assistive Technology Center. It's run by United Cerebral Palsy, but we see everybody, saw everybody, not just with CP. And I did the AAC evaluations there for the past 21 years. And I found myself saying the same thing to parents over and over and over again, half a dozen times a day, week after week after week. And I finally thought there has got to be a way to get this information into the hands of parents everywhere, more consistently, and not just in my little corner of the world here. And people said, well, you should write a book. And I thought, all right, maybe. A couple of years ago, I was asked by an online CEU provider to write a dozen continuing ed hours for augmentative communication. And so I had that material, and I thought, okay, we can turn this into a book, and we can make a roadmap for parents as well as speech pathologists to follow. Here's the terminology. Here's what this means. Here are your options. Here's what an assessment should look like. Here's what intervention looks like. Here's how to do aided language stimulation. Here's where to go from there. And so I put together a book, and my working title was Parents and Professionals in Partnership, because I wanted the speech pathologists and the parents to be on the same page, doing the same things, making it possible for their child and student to be able to communicate. And so it ended up being called Make the Connection. It's Make the Connection, a practical guide for parents and practitioners to teach the nonverbal child to communicate. It's a mouthful. But if you go on Amazon and you just put in Make the Connection, I pop up. And so I'm really hopeful that it will be helpful to parents everywhere, as well as to speech pathologists. So I'm pleased. I've gotten some good reviews so far, and I'm working on spreading the word farther and farther, and hoping that it's something that helps people.
Yeah, definitely. I was looking at it on Amazon. It looks like an amazing resource. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on today before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
Okay, perfect.
A lot of territory.
Yeah, a lot of great stuff. All right. Well, Susan, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your expertise.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I hope that you enjoyed listening to today's show. And as always, if you like what you heard, please take a second to give a 5-star review on iTunes to help your fellow SLPs find the show. And don't forget that one lucky winner who reviews the show by January 15th of 2019 will win a free annual subscription to the digital SLP membership site. To access the show notes from today's episode, go to bit.ly/AAC podcast. So that's bit.ly/AAC podcast. Okay, everyone, that is it for me for today. I thank you for tuning in as always, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.